This lesson, we're continuing with our arguments for the existence of God, or the reason why we ought to believe in God, with Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas Aquinas was born in Italy and lived in the 1200s. And it's important to note that Aquinas was heavily influenced by Aristotle. And we're going to see a lot of Aristotle-like arguments in Aquinas for the existence of God. Aquinas presents 5 arguments for the existence of God. This is different from Pascal, who simply expressed that we can't reason whether or not God exists. Aquinas is going to give us 5 different arguments for the existence of God. The first 4 of these arguments, the cosmological arguments, are all going to play on a very similar principle, the principle of sufficient reason. The 5th argument is going to stand on its own as the teleological argument in terms of expressing the existence of God through purpose. So let's take a look at each one of these arguments individually. The first argument is the argument from change. It's also often referred to as the argument from motion. And essentially, it goes like this. Everything changes or moves, and that change or move has to be changed or moved by something else. But that something else also has to be changed or moved by something that changes or moves. And so, if I move a cup from one side of the table to the other side of the table, the cup has moved because my hand has picked it up and moved it. But what moves my hand? Well, my brain moves my hand to pick up the cup. So what moves my brain? Certain chemicals in my brain tell me to move my hand to pick up the glass, to move it. The reason that the chemicals fire in my brain are because some social circumstance has told me to do this. And here, Aquinas is saying that if everything essentially that moves is caused by something else that moves, we can't go on reducing this infinitely backwards. So there can't be an infinite reduction of changes. Change can't always have occurred. There needs to be something that is the first movement or the first change that was not moved or changed by anything else. And this is what we understand God to be. God is essentially the first mover, setting the rest of the universe into motion. So if we were to look at the current understanding of the universe and the Big Bang, we would see that when we get back to the point of the Big Bang, we would still need to think of a way to explain why the movement occurred to create the bang. There needs to be something that caused it. And we can't go on reducing causes infinitely, so there needs to be something to set everything else into motion. This principle of sufficient reason, this suggestion that causes cannot be infinite, is known as this principle of sufficient reason. There is always sufficient reason for something to occur. But this sufficient reason can't go on infinitely. There has to be a starting point. That starting point is God. We're going to see that for the rest of these cosmological arguments, that Aquinas will rely on the principle of sufficient reason, and ultimately suggests that we can't have an infinite reduction, because this will lead us to a problem, one that we'll talk about later on. The next argument is the argument for efficient causation. Very similar to the last argument, essentially what Aquinas is saying here is that everything has a cause. Everything has a reason. So, my moving my hand is caused by something else. That thing is caused by something else, is caused by something else, is caused by something else. We cannot go reducing causes infinitely, because how can we get a first cause without something that itself was caused? This is why an infinite reduction is often problematic. Even thinking of an infinity is very troubling. Conceiving of what it means to be infinite is often very problematic, because it would seem as though an infinity couldn't exist in the physical world. And this is what Aquinas is really focusing on with these first four arguments. He's suggesting that if we are to look at the world based on physics and science, we ought to believe that the world works according to certain principles and laws. Namely, that physical things cause other physical things to happen. But if the world of physics relies on this cause and effect relationship, then every cause is itself going to have another cause, which itself is going to have a previous cause and a previous cause and a previous cause. But you can't do that forever, because nothing can be the cause of itself. There needs to be a first cause, a thing to set everything else into effect. And so that thing is God. Aquinas' third argument is the argument of possibility and necessity. And here he's again using the same type of foundation for his argument. Aquinas is suggesting that things either exist or they don't exist. Right? Things either necessarily exist, which means they have to exist, or things contingently exist, meaning that they could have existed or they could have not existed. Contingent existence is something that's existed under certain conditions. So, for instance, my existence as a human being is contingent on the fact that my parents had a child. My parents could have not had a child, but they did, so my existence is contingent on them, and their existence is contingent on their parents, and so on and so forth. And so if something can fail to exist, if something is contingent, there must have been a time when that thing didn't exist. Namely, my existence was before I was born. Right? Before I was born, I did not exist, but then I was brought into existence by my parents. So when we look at the world of physics again, we see that the existence of everything is contingent on the thing before it that created it. If we were to go back and make the claim that everything is contingent on something else, right? Everything exists for or because of something else. We couldn't necessarily do that forever, right? Because once again, an infinite regress of contingencies would suggest that nothing ever existed to start the rest of existence. Instead, what you would need is something to necessarily exist and that has to exist, that couldn't have not existed. This is what we call God. Again, a necessary existence is something that exists that comes from nothing. And we think of God in that way. God is eternal and exists always, and from God, the rest of the universe can be created contingently. Now, this brings up an important, somewhat counter argument, in that what is it that created God? And if God can exist necessarily, why can't other things exist necessarily? We can also see the same line of reasoning with causation and motion and change. If the Big Bang had to have been caused by something else, why doesn't God have to be caused by something else? And essentially, the line of reasoning to defend this position is that Aquinas is speaking strictly in physical terms and about the physical world. The physical world relies on physical laws of motion and existence, while God falls outside of that realm, as it were. So I can say that material things, mountains, rocks, hydrogen atoms, because they're physical, they need to have come from somewhere and couldn't have always existed. Because if they always existed, then they themselves would have had to create themselves. And if they create, and it doesn't make sense to suggest that something can create itself. When we look at God, however, God is not bound to the world of physics in the physical realm, according to Aquinas. And so we don't need to worry about an infinite reduction when it comes to God. God is outside of time. God is outside of space. And so shouldn't rely on the rules of space or time to govern his actions or existence. When we look at the physical world, it is bound by physical laws. And physical laws will dictate, or seem to dictate, that things need causation. Things that move need something to move it, and so forth. The last of the cosmological arguments, again, focuses on the same type of reasoning, the principle of sufficient reason, and that there cannot be an infinite reduction of things. And Aquinas argues that there are gradations to be found in things. So essentially, things are better or truer than other things. Things are harder, stronger. And so that same understanding can be taken with things that are good. Some things are better than others. Some things are worse than others. We can assume that certain metals are stronger or harder than others, just like we can assume that some actions are better or more good than others. Now, if that were the case, every action, every good action, right, could potentially have something more good to compare it to. There was always more. There was always better. There was always worse. There was always lesser. And so Aquinas is going to say, we can't have an infinitely better sequence of things. So there must be something that's maximally good. Something that is of the highest quality, of the best quality, something that is essentially perfect. And Aristotle comes to this same realization when he talks about, for instance, eudaimonia, this concept of understanding, right, ultimate happiness or human fulfillment. Essentially, what is maximally good, what is maximally perfect, has to be God. Because when we think of perfect, to Aquinas, it is this thing that he calls God. And so using this principle of sufficient reason, by suggesting that we can't have an infinite regress, we can reason that God must exist. And again, going back to this idea of an infinite regress, we would even see the problem with this in that if time were infinite, if space were infinite, then there would be an infinite amount of time before my existence. And if there were an infinite amount of time before my existence, it would seem problematic that for some reason my existence is happening now, because traversing an infinite series seems very problematic. And we can see this in instances of Zeno's paradoxes from ancient Greece, who even argued this same argument for the existence of motion. Zeno believed that motion was not real, was an illusion. And he believed that because he saw that in order to move from point A to point B, so in order for me to get to my front door, I would need to get halfway. And in order to get halfway, I would need to get halfway to that point. And then halfway to that point, and halfway to that point, and halfway to that point. If you've ever divided 1 into 2 on one of those old calculators where you can just continually hit the equal button and it will continually divide, you will see that no matter how many times you hit the equal button, you will never get back to 0. Because there are an infinite number of small points between any two objects. So if there were an infinite amount of points between my existence and the beginning, which there is no beginning, right? It just goes infinitely backward. Right? It would seem as though I could never get to any point through an infinite series. There would need to be a starting point for me in order for me to traverse a series. One other problem with an infinite reduction and simply just thinking about infinity is that if we were to suggest that space and time were infinite, and yet we seem to realize that there are a finite amount of things in the world. When we look at periodic tables, when we look at atoms, we see that the world is comprised of a finite number of things. But in an infinite world, we can see that those finite things can arrange themselves over an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of space. Meaning that if space and time were infinite, at some point in time, in some place, there would be a complete replication of the world, but perhaps with one slight difference. Maybe there's another world that exists exactly like this one exists, but I have a big, thick handlebar mustache, and I'm giving this lecture. And in the world, in this world, I obviously am fairly clean shaven. We would have to accept the fact that somewhere in the world there is a room filled with monkeys typing out Shakespeare's greatest works word for word. Because there's an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of space, but with finite things, all of the atoms should at some point in time recreate duplicates of worlds. And so we end up seeing this problem when we think of just the concept of infinity. Similarly, we can't treat infinity like we treat other numbers or other sets. Right? If I have a set of things, right, I can give you that set. And I will be left with nothing, and you will have my set. Similarly, I can give you half of my set, and now you have half and I have half. I could also give you my set, but keep one thing in that set for myself. So again, let's say I have 10 coins. I can give you all 10 coins. So now you have 10 coins and I have 0 coins. I can give you 5 coins and I can keep 5 coins. And I could also give you 9 coins and I can keep 1 coin for myself. Now, it doesn't seem that an infinity can work in that same way. Because if I had an infinity, I could give you an infinity. I can give you my set, and I could have nothing. Similar to the 10 coins. But here's where it gets tricky. If I wanted to split my infinity in half, I could give you half and I could keep half, but that means we would both now have an infinite, right? Because if I decided I'm going to give you the even number of things in my set and I'm going to keep the odd number of things in my set, well, with a set of infinite, right, there are an infinite number of even and an infinite number of odd, so we will both have an infinite now. Also, what I can do is give you an infinite amount of things, but keep one for myself. Now you still have an infinite, but I have one. And so in scenarios 2 and 3, it's different from the set of 10. Because by splitting an infinite in half, I can't necessarily split an infinite in half. Right? Similarly, if I give you my set but keep one for myself, you should be down one thing, but you're not with an infinite set. And so the whole concept of infinity is incredibly problematic, which is why Aquinas believes that we can't infinitely reduce something, especially in the physical world. Because in terms of the physical world, an infinite is not attainable. It's not real. But we do know it is something because I can look at a number chart and see that a number chart has an infinite number of numbers. So while an infinity is something that makes sense mathematically, in terms of a physical world, it's incredibly problematic. The last of Aquinas' arguments is the argument for the governance of the world. And this is essentially Aquinas' teleological argument. When we think of teleological, we think of purpose, something that has a purpose. And Aquinas says that all things act toward their purpose. A knife cuts. A good knife cuts well, a bad knife does not cut. A mug holds coffee, or hot liquid, or perhaps cold liquid. A bad mug is one that's cracked or that lets the temperature seep through. A good mug is one that holds the water sufficiently and keeps it at the desired temperature. Now, if everything acts towards its purpose, we see that things are only given purpose by things that have within it that purpose. So, for instance, a thing that lacks consciousness can only act towards its end by something that is conscious. So, again, take the knife, for example. A knife has a purpose because it is used by a conscious being for that specific purpose. We have created in a knife its purpose to do something. So there needs to be a conscious and intelligent being that directs everything in nature towards its end. What gives humanity purpose? What gives the world purpose? It needs to be God. And there's often a famous kind of thought experiment, or question rather, that really puts this into perspective. Imagine you're walking in the woods and you find a pocket watch lying next to a tree. Would it make more sense that such a complex object was dropped there by a person it was created and placed there, or that the universe just naturally created this very complex object that has all of these gears working for a very specific purpose to tell the time. It would seem for most of us, it would make sense that if this scenario were to occur, we would believe that that watch were left there by some person. Similarly, when we look at ourselves and the complex nature of humans, we see that there are purposes for us. There is a purpose for my eyes to see, a purpose for my heart to pump blood. And so this complex creature that is a human and other animals and other things would similarly make more sense if it were created for these purposes rather than evolution just happening to make everything in this random but purposeful sort of way. Because Aquinas believed that there was such purpose, there needed to be something to give that purpose, and that thing is God. There are, however, many counter-arguments to Aquinas' 5 ways, both the teleological argument and the cosmological arguments. We could counter Aquinas by suggesting that there could be an infinite reduction, that time and space are infinite. But once again, you get a very odd picture of that, in that we would have to then acknowledge the possibility of possible worlds or possible realities that are exactly like this one. We might suggest that things have no purpose, and that if things have no purpose, then there doesn't need to be something that gives it purpose. We can explain the world through evolution, and clearly, with the advancement of science between Aquinas' time and today, we seem to have pieced together evolution pretty well to explain how one thing comes from another. Now, there still are attributes of Aquinas' arguments that are difficult to overcome, namely this idea of the principle of sufficient reason, and whether or not we could or could not have an infinite reduction of physical things. Two of the main arguments, though, against the existence of God are going to be the argument for inconsistent revelations and the problem of evil. And these two arguments will be the focus of the next lecture.